like I said, it takes place in the New settlement region, which our mandate is to understand how climate change impacts the coast here and the nearshore region. And there's about 18,000 kilometers of coast. And all in all, the overall erosion rate is about 1 to 1.2 meters a year, which is quite significant over such a large area. But we can see, as you're going to see in the presentation, erosion rates up to 40 meters a year. Before I start, I have to acknowledge all of our partners, all of our funding agencies, the community members that help with this project. And we wouldn't have this knowledge to share today if it wasn't for all of the partners and all of the collaborators, and some of you are on this call, so thank you in person. So I'll start here with shoreline type. So here's the Yukon and Northwest Territories coastal region around Tuktoyaktuk and the Mackenzie Delta. And here you can see that we have documented shoreline type from height. And here, this is really where the focus of the erosion is, on shoreline type and shoreline height. So when we look at type, the type varies across the region, from sand coasts to huge thaw failures to low-lying deltas and low-lying tundra as well. Here, one of our students, Rodrigue from University of Lisbon, looked at how shoreline type and erosion are related, and this is over in Darnley Bay. And he did a good job of showing that where you have unconsolidated permafrost, large cliffs, you have an increased susceptibility for erosion. In other areas where you have different types of material at different heights, you have less erosion. When I mean less erosion, we're still talking 1 meter. We're not talking 30 to 40 meters. 1 meter is still significant, though. There's 4 coastal communities that we look at in this region, Tuktoyaktuk being maybe one of the more popular ones. There's Paulatuk in Sax Harbor and Uluhaktuk not shown here. All of these communities have their own coastal issues, and all of these communities are in different phases of adaptation awareness about these coastal issues. And looking outside the communities, I want to look at the types of shoreline dynamics or the types of erosion. And there's really when you're looking at stalling erosion in the Arctic, you really have to try to maintain the frozen ground. And that's the problem. So the first impact or the first real show of erosion there is permafrost thaw. And here's an example of permafrost thaw in a thaw failure. You can see that the material just flows like a river or a typical mud flow. In this case, this is a time-lapse camera taking a shot every 5 minutes over a few days. You can see the continuous flow and slough off of material from the cliff. So I show these images and videos to highlight that it's not a typical coastline that we see in the rest of Canada, where the main action of erosion is the force of waves. Here, we need to spend an equal amount of time understanding how thermally this coast is eroded as well. And so Mike Lim has designed a method to actually track the coast. Here, if I press play, you should see, yeah. So he's able to track all of the material coming off the cliff, and we're able to use that to understand, well, what temperature, what season, what time of day or year this material is most vulnerable. And again, as he passes the thermal camera over the cliff, we can see how the cliff spatially looks as well, and where the vulnerabilities lie. So again, temperature is playing a huge role. Remember, the goal is, when you're trying to mitigate against erosion in the Arctic, is to keep everything frozen. And obviously, this is not the case right now. They vary from Dalhousie. Her study looked at how seasonal variation in temperature actually impacts the morphological response of the cliff. So she looked at one specific area, Pullen Island, over a few years, and she was able to determine what the role of temperature played in how this cliff is eroded and how this thaw failure responds. Now we get into the typical erosion, which is erosion by force, erosion by waves, or a mechanical erosion, where the waves undercut and eat away at the soil, whether it's frozen or unfrozen, and it can cause material to erode away into the sea or fail, like you see that cliff there that I'm sitting on. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Pelly Island, which is one of the most eroded islands in the world, and this is a good image that shows the cliff a few years ago now, but this is a typical summer image where you can see the dramatic erosion here in just that 4-month open water season, and it's 40 meters. So again, the action of waves repeatedly against this coast causes this erosion, but it's often it can go also quite fast as well, as Mike shows here in this image, where we did repeat time-lapse imagery across Pelly Island, and below we have a 3-day time series. So day 1 on one side leading into day 3, and you can see that pinnacle has just fell into the water from the action of waves. So what this study has allowed us to do is come up with a conclusion, and maybe it's kind of obvious, but it's still good to have the scientific rigor behind it. The conclusion is that there is a positive correlation between erosion and temperature and storminess or wave height. Now we get into, well, we know that storminess has increased. We know that temperature has increased in the area. So how does that affect erosion? Well, just in this general region, we see a general acceleration of the erosion of the areas that I've already highlighted over the past 20 or so years. And this paper by Nielsen showed that in the next 80 years, there could be a tripling of erosion across the Arctic. So I think that's very significant. And it also shows the strong connection to all of the other climate drivers. So that was the kind of the primer of what's happening in the Arctic at an extreme level, but I think it's important to understand it. And now I want to talk about the community. And I'll focus on Tuktoyaktuk in particular. Here's a shot of Tuk, obviously feeling the force of waves. And I think Tuktoyaktuk is no stranger to this, and probably everyone has heard of Tuk. It was recently in the front page of the New York Times last December. So Tuk is kind of at the forefront of what's happening with climate change in Canada, and I think it's how it reacts, I think, is getting a lot of attention. So right now, the current erosion rate along the main part of the community is about 1.1 to 1.5 meters a year. There's other parts of the community like Tuktoyaktuk Island that are eroding faster than that. But the main part of the community is eroding at that rate. And so, but this is where people live, and this is where people have to think of ways to adapt and mitigate climate change. And what's interesting is the lower image shows Tuk in 1935. It's been around for a long time. That northern spit was quite wide at one point, and it hasn't gone. If you talk to people in the region, it actually erosion is something that has been around for a long time, but not 100 years. So the first 70 years of Tuk's existence, people weren't as concerned about erosion as they are today. So this really speaks to how climate change has impacted this community. And the community over the years has tried to try its own ways to mitigate. You see the installation of concrete mats here. We see some sandbags, and we see some look like concrete piles or small little concrete blocks. And in all of these cases, there's evidence. Well, there's the evidence to suggest that these didn't really work. Although the concrete mats are still in place and still preventing shoreline erosion, there's a number of telltale signs that even this has to be mitigated in the future. Okay. And what's interesting is 1984 I just have 2018. That's the drone image we had available at that scale. So, but what's interesting is in 1984, you can see the large cliffs. You can see a lot of natural. The entire coastline was natural, and now years later, but really starting in around 2000 is when the community started to apply many different strategies for shore protection to the community. And I think I would argue that in most cases the idea of shore protection has been unnatural. Although I've heard people say that rocks from a nearby quarry could be considered natural. So you can see a lot of riprap. You can see a lot of rocks. Now, I think it's very important to also state that although they installed riprap or quarry rock along the coast, it still failed in certain positions over the years. And then so that really led to where we are today. Oh, I spelled the word wrong. I told you I would. And where we are today is the community has taken action through an engineering firm, Baird, to use the same quarry rock, but in an engineered way and using engineering design to enhance the placement along the slope so that it'll stay for a lot longer. And the projected lifetime of this shore protection that you see in front of you is about 20 to 30 years. And that really is satisfactory for the community because not only is it facing this problem of erosion and land loss, there's a lot of concern over sea level rise. So possibly Tuktoyaktuk is looking at relocation or areas where it can adapt in place because of future flooding. And this erosion mitigation will give them time. So not including that quarry rock that we just saw, I'm going to talk about my own ideas of what nature-based solutions can do on this rapidly eroding cliff. And I kind of thought about it in three ways: the role of nature in building resilience, and you can look at vegetation, natural vegetation, and even sand dunes. And I think there's a pretty interesting story there. Uh, Also harnessing nature's potential for adaptation and mitigation. This is through driftwood. Anyone who's been to the area knows that there's lots and lots of driftwood. And using that as a natural protection to allow for accommodation space for change. Hopefully, I'll show you an example of that. And lastly, and I think very important, is leveraging Indigenous knowledge for effective solutions. Spending time listening and learning, and really recognizing the use of traditional knowledge where people who have lived off the land for a long time and have adapted in various ways. So first, I'll talk about the role of nature in building resilience, sand dunes. I think this is a really interesting story. Thank you to Rebecca for initiating this study and progressing through it. So basically, Rebecca and others went up to the a sand dune just north of Tuck that is migrating on top of lowland ice wedge polygons. And she was able to look at how that sand acts as an insulator. So remember the goal, keep the land frozen for as long as you can, because that's when it's the most stable. And so she was able to prove that in areas where the sand dune overlies the ice wedge polygons, we have a thicker active layer and a thicker permafrost zone. So this tells us that possibly the sand is acting as an insulator in the summer months, so that the permafrost layer can continue to grow. Vegetation. Again, Rebecca teamed up with the Aurora Research Institute here, it's Erica Hale, to look at vegetation. And the project was initially known as the SEED project, where they wanted to look at what the baseline data for if possibly the people could revegetate these active coasts. And it was very interesting, but so they looked at bare ground, they looked at the vegetated ground, and then these transplanted vegetated mats. And these are the vegetated mats that are eroded off the cliff and are kind of in along the flow. And the flow doesn't happen all the time, right? It stops and starts depending on the temperature. So there is some hope that these revegetated mats may vegetate, may start growing again. So they looked at that, and it was really a fascinating study where areas that were undisturbed, so I guess the natural environment, they got quite cold in the temperature in general was colder than the areas that had some sort of vegetation, whether that was new vegetation or transplanted vegetation. So again, the vegetation played a role in insulating the soil to keep it frozen for longer or colder. And I think this is a really neat study. The problem with it is that the coast is way too dynamic, and nothing really can stay in one spot for any amount of time. So I think unless you can create accommodation space or a spot for this material to flow, then it's really just going to flow out to sea and all the vegetation with it every time. So you've seen this before, and this is really interesting study where we put a temperature probe in the region, and you can see that in this sequence, when we can see consistent flow, the air temperature is always above 8 degrees. And in the next picture, where you see no flow at all, the temperature for those 3 days is below 8 degrees. But the problem is this is along the coast. So this time-lapse image with temperature superimposed on it shows that, yes, we see flow when the temperature reaches above 8 degrees, but we see storm and increased wave action sometimes when the temperature is below 8 degrees. So no matter what, if you are able to thaw the material onto the beach, maybe there's a potential for new growth, that there's a potential for some stability, but that is instantly washed away during the next storm. So my next idea, harnessing the nature's potential for adaptation mitigation through driftwood. Driftwood is very popular there. There's lots of pockets of driftwood everywhere. And you can see here where Roger McLeod and Scott Dallymore and others looked at how driftwood can be used as a proxy for past storms and past high water levels. But what's neat about that research is that it tells us that the driftwood has been around for a long time. So where it parks or where it drifts to during high water and storms is usually where it stays. So this becomes an instant barrier. And I'm gonna, I think, yes. So here's just a drone fly through of Tuktoyaktuk. I'll zoom in later, but you can see there was some of the shore protection. You can see the community sits on some low-lying tundra. And then here is an area of all driftwood. And I'll show you here. So we just passed the area of all driftwood highlighted by the yellow rectangle, and it sits right along the road here. And yes, the road was a barrier to prevent the driftwood from going over in the high water. But now that the driftwood acts as a barrier against the force of the ocean, so the road is actually quite stable because it has that driftwood barrier there. One of the best examples of how driftwood is really playing a role in this natural ability to protect the coastline is at Shingle Point, and that's over in the Yukon coast. So, oh darn. I thought this is an animation, but there's a map in the back from Franklin from 1825. And on that map, Franklin shows Shingle Point. And Shingle Point still exists today. So it's a 9-kilometer long sand spit. How does it still exist today in almost the exact form it existed on that original map? The answer is driftwood. So this island has a huge history of repetitive storms bringing in driftwood, and then sand overtopping that driftwood, and it's kind of like a layer cake of driftwood sand, and it's been able to maintain its shape and stability such that the community really takes advantage of this spit for its whaling and fishing in the summer. And I like that picture, that zoom in picture in the corner, where the driftwood is such a stable feature of this area that they actually had to move the wood aside to create little pathways through for their ATVs and quads to access the beach. So my last thought, again, it's on driftwood again, but it's not using driftwood in where it naturally falls. It's thinking about how people can use driftwood in a way to make the areas that they want to work or play or or hunt more stable. And this is over at East Whitefish, which is a very popular whaling camp near Tuktoyaktuk. And um, and so through the stories that are shared and passed down, people know that driftwood can not only be a tool for heating, it's also a tool for shore protection. And here at this little camp, they have stacked driftwood in such a way that it protects the region. So whereas I'll go back, so you don't see any cabins on that spit, other cabins. Well, believe it or not, they were there about 10 years ago, and we used to stay in them. But now since then, they've been washed away. But this cabin area owned by the Lenny family, because they used traditional knowledge and they knew that driftwood could be a natural asset and a natural barrier, they basically fortified their camp here. So no matter what the coastline looks like, I think you have to look at it from a different perspective, and not all perspectives, in my feelings, should come from a southern-based scientist or engineer. I think there's a lot of things that within the Inuit and Nuvialua culture that have been maintained through the years that are really helping and form, in a sense, a nature-based solution in its own. So I think these are my wrap-up slides, which is pretty good time. In conclusion, the Canadian Beaufort Seacoast is eroding up to 45 meters a year. Its erosion rates may double or even triple in the next 80 years. Communities like Tuktoyaktuk will always need to find solutions and innovative ways to adapt. And what can nature-based do in one of the most eroded coastlines in the world? Well, my conclusion are we should continue to rely on natural barriers that are already in place. We should harness nature's potential for adaptation. And lastly, leverage Indigenous knowledge. That's the talk. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And again, thank you to everyone who's participated over the years. We have a very diverse and unique teams and partners, and I'm thankful for everyone.
Thank you, Dustin. That was such an interesting presentation. And yeah, it's just a great privilege for all of us to learn from your decades of field experience, which not many people in this world have. In particular, I really liked your discussion about driftwood just because I saw the abundance of it when I was there too. So now we're just going to go into a question period. So if any of the participants have any questions, please raise your hand. If you don't want to speak out loud using your microphone, you can also type the question in the chat itself and I'll read it out on your behalf. But I see one already there, so I'll go to the first question. Luke.
Hey, Dustin, thanks so much for your presentation. It was super interesting. I've heard a lot about the use of vegetation for shoreline erosion mitigation, but the way I've understood that it works is mainly for wave attenuation, whereas you were talking about it being used more as an insulator. Does it have that benefit as well, where it's also attenuating waves when it was used in this study?
So we never actually looked at the use of, or the presence of vegetation as a way to mitigate waves. Absolutely, there are lots of areas that are eroding fast, that are quite vegetated, and there's probably areas that are eroding slow that are less vegetated. I actually think that vegetation probably doesn't matter against the force of waves in general, because usually the erosion happens after quite dramatic storms, And I don't think that erosion, I don't think that the vegetation would make that much of a difference. And remember, we're above the tree line. There's not that much vegetation. You can see a community member, Obi, standing in what is a typical vegetated or revegetated area. So I think vegetation really doesn't make any difference at all against the force of waves here.
Great, thank you so
Awesome.
much.
We had one question in the chat from Marc-André. Have you mentioned where all this driftwood is coming from? Gavin answered, but maybe you have another perspective, Dustin.
Oh, I didn't see Gavin's answer. But whatever Gavin said is right. But because I can't see what he said, I'll say that it comes down the Mackenzie Delta and the Mackenzie River as one source. So from areas that are in the tree line down the main Mackenzie River, and it also can actually come around and drift around from Alaska and BC as well.
That's pretty much what Gavin said. So next we have Phil Osborne.
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks, Dustin. Really great presentation. Really enjoyed it. I'm going to ask a question or just a comment about the driftwood part as well, because I think it's really interesting to see that you've got some examples there where it's clearly been in place for a long time, and it has been effective. So I think there's scope for a study to look at examples where driftwood has been really effective in shore protection and where it maybe hasn't been. I'm thinking about a community that I've looked at quite a bit in Alaska, Shaktoolik, where the community there started incorporating driftwood basically on their own into their berm to provide protection, and it sort of made a difference. But I think they've discontinued really focusing on that because in some cases it didn't work. When they got a really big storm, the driftwood tended to launch and become more of a hazard than a protector. So I guess context is really important, and I would love to see more work done on that. And I think there's scope to do that, in a variety of different contexts. So just wondering about, is there potential that you could carry on that work and tell us more about it in the future, because it really is interesting.
That's a great point, and I totally agree. It's a really neat part of nature that is just there and kind of ready to be harnessed. So we are working with NRC. Looking at that, and I know Enda Murphy, if he's on the call, he has a long history of working with driftwood, so he's on a project with us, or we're with him, where we're going to continue that and look at the transport of driftwood and how it moves and how it can withstand certain forces of waves in certain areas. Yeah, so absolutely, there's a future in looking at driftwood, and I think there's a lot of research that still could be had. Like I mentioned, Shingle Point. I mean, this is so fascinating over there. What's happening to that spit, or what has happened over the last 150 years?
Yeah, that's an amazing example and a great one. Where there's a spit that has had some positive influence from the presence of driftwood there, and it would be interesting to share that with the team in Shaktoolik to see what's the difference here and maybe compare and contrast, because Shaktoolik's also a spit which has quite a bit of driftwood supply on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. We had a question in the comments from Rebecca Duggan. Are you seeing increased shoreline loss adjacent to the armored areas? I'm guessing in relation to Tuktoyaktuk's new armored areas.
Yep, we sure are. And that's Coastal Science 101. So there was kind of a what's the word? A real urgency to when they did the shore protection, the huge strategy to put it all as fast as they could. So they got about halfway last winter because they have to install it in the winter, and then the other half of the coastline was kind of still exposed with some of the old protection and natural. And even last summer, we saw that area experience increased erosion. But now that this winter, right now, that they're actively kind of finishing the job. So yeah, absolutely. If they didn't kind of choose an area that was kind of complete from spit to spit, then we would have seen huge repercussions. But the engineers did a great job in choosing that area and really applying the mitigation strategy with urgency to get it done. So you don't see that.
Another question in the comments from Alan Wang. I've seen material about using mangroves and other deep-rooted plants to prevent erosion in more tropical regions as their roots hold better in the soil. Wondering if some native plants in the Arctic are more deeply rooted than others and maybe more suited to staying in place, which is a problem you mentioned about using plants as insulation.
Great question, Alan. And to my knowledge, they're not deeply rooted at all. And that has to do with the active layer or the active layer is the seasonal part of the soil that's not frozen in the summer. And so there's only so much space or so much thickness of this for the roots to go down. And usually this is about a half meter or less, or sometimes more, but we rarely see roots that are deeply rooted, and it's because of the active layer. They just don't have the room to grow before that soil freezes up again.
I don't see any more hands up, but I do have one question. You know, with the upcoming summer, any sneak peeks of your field campaigns this summer? Any interesting stuff that you'll be working on?
That's a good question. So yeah, so I spent my career in Tuktoyaktuk, and we continue to work in Tuk and help look at now we're looking at helping the community understand what the inner harbor looks like. We've spent lots of time in the outer harbor, but I'm also venturing to the other communities, Ulahugtuk, Palatuk, and Sax Harbor, and the coastlines around there. So we'll spend time and hopefully developing the same deep research data set over on Beggs Island, over Darnley Bay, and then Victoria Island as well.
One question from Rebecca with her hand up. Yeah.
Hi, I was just interested in the insulating effect that you mentioned with the sand dunes and such. So if you were to have some sort of insulating mitigation in the coastal zone to try and keep the temperature down in one way or another, how far inland do you think you'd need to go with that approach? Like how much ground do you think you'd need to cover really to have an impact?
So all we've done is look at natural sand dunes and the natural aeolian process of the wind. And you know, the sand is quite thick over the tundra up there. So how far inland would we have to deposit sand on top of the tundra to create an insulating effect?
Yeah, like say you wanted to replicate the effect. In that manner.
I would say pretty far. I mean, like, I don't really know. That's a great question, but yeah, I don't know. Probably within the limit of the wave run up and the maximum storm surge. Mind you, I don't know if sand is the you know, one of the best solutions. It's just something that seems to work naturally. I don't know if you want to cover your coast with sand, but I would say that as long as you're above the maximum wave height storm surge, it'll probably stay in place and then create some sort of insulation for the underlying tundra so it doesn't thaw out.
Okay, thank you.
Any last questions from anybody? If not, oh, then okay. There's first from Devlin. I wonder if the sand dunes would be effective in the community of Tuck with all the sediment transportation happening in the waterways.
Great question, Diva. So Diva is from Tuktoyaktuk, and so she asked that question concerned about her own backyard. I would say probably not. And this is why I think, like for instance, where the shore protection is right now, there's not a long beachfront. So the sand that you have would probably have to, the initial slope of the sand coming up to where the houses are would have to be pretty great, and it would be quite vulnerable to the action of waves. If you were to somehow increase that beachfront, like on low water days, if you could have that all throughout the entire year, I think that probably sand would act as an excellent barrier in mitigation against thawing permafrost. But where it stands now in Tuck, there's not that much beach, so the waves will instantly get rid of that sand. That's what I think.
Alex has her hand up.
Yeah, I was actually wondering if you could kind of re-explain what you were saying about the air temperature correlation. You were kind of saying something about like we see temperatures above 8 degrees Celsius or below 8 degrees Celsius, whether there's like flow or vegetation movement or not. I was wondering what's the significance of the 8 degrees, or if you could just re-explain kind of what you were talking about there.
Yeah. So I cannot tell you what the significance of 8 degrees are, other than when the temperature was over 8, we seem to have lots of flow. So, you know, that I don't know what the empirical formula is, or maybe that works out. That's kind of something that's well known, but we were quite shocked to see that it's almost perfectly aligned with that 8-degree mark. Whereas when it's below 8 degrees, there's no flow. So this could be a discovery. This could be something that climatologists already knew. But for us, it was a discovery where we didn't know that there was that temperature threshold of movement versus no movement.
Question from Alan Wang. Can floating wave attenuators be used when constructing fortifications to prevent the unconstructed areas from being eroded before everything is finished?
Great question, Alan. And Alan's going to learn all about the Arctic next week when he starts his co-op. And he'll learn that there's 9 months of sea ice in this region. And so there's no way we could have a floating infrastructure in the water because the sea ice comes in early October and it lasts all the way till June. So that's why they can't really use a barge system or any system that extends into the ocean because it'll get pushed around by the massive sea ice chunks and landfast ice that's there. And the ice can be 1.5 meters thick by the end of the season. So you can imagine that also mechanically moving around. It can easily push any sort of protection that's sitting there. In fact, this photo at the very beginning is an example of how ice can damage infrastructure quite easily. So that's a barge. There's a barge. In my lifetime, 20 years ago, that was a barge you could walk on top of. You could place things, you could have lunch, and now look at it. There's some impact of waves in the open water season, but mainly it's ice push destroying this wooden feature.
All right. Thank you, Dustin, again for taking the time to contribute to this. We do have one last question. I mean, we still have a couple of minutes before 3. So does the driftwood onshore also get pushed around by ice pileup or chip away from the freeze thaw action by Christoph?
Yeah, definitely gets moved around in storms. and that's some of our future work where, and the folks from NRC are going to look at how much it gets pushed around. Is there, does it get pushed around by ice? Yeah, I would say definitely. I mean, Diva can tell you, and anyone who's been to Tuck, it is unbelievable how big some of these ice, some of this driftwood is, and where it exists on the coast. So either the storm was, you know, an historical storm that nobody can really remember, pushed this log up here, or it was pushed by the action of ice pushing along the coast. So yeah, it can absolutely be pushed by ice and as well as the force of water.
Awesome. Thank you, Dustin, again.
Mhm.
Thank you, everyone else who participated in here. Thank you for all your comments on the polls. We'll definitely use that to steer this community practice on nature-based solutions and one of the most dynamic shores in the world. Alex just put some links to our social media stuff if you'd like to stay updated with our webinars. And yeah, once again, thank you all. It seems like there's a big appetite for these webinars, knowledge sharing in the Arctic. You know, we had 60 participants today at the peak. So yeah, again, thank you everyone, especially Dustin, who took the time to share the knowledge. So thanks again. Hope everyone has a good remainder of their day.
Thank you. My pleasure.